Hello everyone, it's Bigfoot Theory here. Today we're going back to 1847. Picture yourself as a scientist in London sitting in your study when a colleague bursts into your room with the most absurd claim that you've ever heard. He's telling you about a massive ape standing over 6 feet tall, weighing 400 pounds, living in the forests of Africa. An ape so powerful it could tear a man apart, yet somehow completely unknown to Western science. You'd call him a fool, wouldn't you? That's exactly what happened to Paul du Chaillu, the explorer who first brought gorilla specimens to the Western world. The scientific community didn't just doubt him, they ridiculed him. They said it was impossible. How could a creature that powerful and large exist without being documented? The forests of Africa were being explored. Missionaries were there, traders were there. Surely, if this gorilla existed, someone would have found concrete evidence by now. But here's the thing, the gorilla did exist. It always had, and the local people knew about it all along. Before we dive into what this means for Bigfoot research, let's talk about how impossible the gorilla seemed to 19th century science. We're not talking about a small, shy creature hiding in the underbrush. Gorillas are massive. Silverback males can weigh up to 430 pounds and stand 6 feet tall when upright. They live in family groups, they're active during daylight hours, and they inhabit regions that were being actively explored by Europeans. By all logic, they should have been discovered centuries earlier. The first documented Western encounter came from Andrew Battelle, an English sailor who was held captive in West Africa around 1590. He described enormous apes the local people called pongos and ngeko. His accounts were published in 1625, but they were largely dismissed as sailors' tales, the kind of exaggerated stories that come from too much time at sea and too much rum. For over 200 years, these stories persisted in explorer accounts and logical indigenous knowledge, but Western science refused to acknowledge them. The creatures were considered mythological, like dragons, unicorns, or sea monsters. The establishment position was clear. If such animals existed, we would know about them. Does this sound familiar? The turning point came in 1847 when Thomas Savage, an American missionary, obtained gorilla skulls and bones in Gabon. He sent them to autonomous Jeffries Wyman, and together they published the first scientific description of a gorilla. Even then, the scientific community remained skeptical. Many dismantled the species as unusual chimpanzees or hoaxes. It wasn't until Paul du Chaillu's expeditions in the 1850s and 1860s that gorillas were finally accepted as real. And here's what's crucial. Du Chaillu was able to prove their existence because he shot them. He killed gorillas, brought their bodies back to museums, and put them on display where skeptics could examine them directly. This is what it took to convince science of something the local people had known for centuries. Let's pause here, because this raises uncomfortable questions about what we require as proof. The indigenous peoples of Central Africa had lived alongside gorillas for thousands of years. They had names for them in their languages. They had cultural traditions and hunting practices built around them. They knew these animals existed, but their knowledge didn't count. Western science demanded Western evidence, specimens, measurements, taxonomic classifications. Until a white explorer could shoot one and bring it back to a museum, the gorilla remained a myth. Now let's bring this back to North America and what we call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Indigenous peoples across the continent have always known about these creatures. Different tribes have different names, but the descriptions remain remarkably consistent. Large bipedal primates covered in hair, intelligent, elusive, and living in remote wilderness areas. Just like the gorilla, we have centuries of indigenous knowledge being dismissed as folklore. We have explorer accounts being written off as misidentification or exaggeration. We have witness testimony from credible people, police officers, wildlife biologists, experienced outdoorsmen, being ignored because there's no body on the slab. The parallel here is striking. Before gorillas were quote-unquote discovered, you could find three types of people: the indigenous populations who knew they existed, the explorers who claimed to have seen them but couldn't prove it, and the scientific establishment that refused to believe until forced by physical evidence. With Bigfoot, we're still in that middle phase. We have the indigenous knowledge, we have thousands of witness reports. What we don't have is a body in a museum, so mainstream science continues to dismiss the possibility. The gorilla precedent teaches us something crucial. Even very large animals can remain hidden from scientific documentation for centuries, even in areas with human presence. Consider the conditions that allowed gorillas to remain undiscovered for so long. They lived in dense forests with difficult terrain. They were intelligent and wary of humans. They had large territories and moved through areas that saw only occasional human presence. The local people who knew them had no reason or ability to convince distant Western scientists of their existence. Now consider North America, specifically the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, and the wilderness areas of Canada like Alaska. These are millions of acres of dense forest, mountainous terrain, and wilderness so remote that new species are still being discovered there. Wyoming alone, a place I talked about in a previous video, contains over 62 million acres, with roughly 48% of that being public land. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem encompasses over 20 million acres of interconnected wilderness. You could walk for weeks without seeing another person, and Wyoming is just one state. The Pacific Northwest continues even vaster stretches of old-growth forests and mountainous terrain. British Columbia and Alaska add millions more acres of pristine wilderness. This is a habitat on the scale that dwarfs the Central African forest, where gorillas remain hidden for centuries. Gorillas aren't just physically imposing, they're highly intelligent. They can recognize threats, modify their behavior, and teach survival strategies to their offspring. When they encounter humans, they don't freeze like a deer in headlights. They assess the situation and respond strategically. The encounters I've analyzed on this channel consistently show similar intelligence in alleged Bigfoot behavior. In the Wyoming cases that I recently covered, we saw stalking behavior, the creature pacing a hiker's movements, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. That's not random animal behavior. That's consciousness tracking and surveillance. One thing that critics tend to say in the argument of Bigfoot is, if Bigfoot exists, where are the bodies? Where are the bones? This is a fair question, but it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how rare it is to find remains of large animals in the wild. How often do you encounter a dead bear in the forest, or a dead elk, or maybe even a mountain lion? These are common animals that exist in documented populations, yet their bodies decompose rapidly and are scavenged by other animals, insects, and bacteria. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, organic material disappears incredibly fast. The combination of moisture, heavy vegetation, and insect activity and scavengers means that a body left in the woods might be completely gone within weeks or months. But here's the more important part. We're looking in the wrong places with the wrong methods. Gorillas weren't discovered because someone stumbled across a skeleton in the forest. They were discovered because explorers specifically went looking for them in the right habitat, and eventually one was killed and preserved. With Bigfoot research, we've never had systemic, well-funded expeditions with the specific goal of obtaining a specimen. Most research is done by amateur enthusiasts working on limited budgets in their spare time. We're trying to document one of the more elusive creatures on the continent using weekend camping trips and trail cameras. Imagine trying to discover gorillas using these same methods. You'd probably fail too. Let's talk about why North America could support an undiscovered primate population when the gorilla comparison is often dismissed. North America's forests are incredibly productive. Salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest provide dense protein during spawning season. Deer, elk, and other ungulates are abundant. Nuts, berries, roots, and vegetation provide plant-based food sources across multiple seasons. An omnivorous primate could thrive on this diverse diet. Unlike many regions, North America has abundant, reliable water sources. Mountain streams, rivers, and lakes provide not just hydration, but also food sources and natural travel conditions. The mountainous, heavily forested terrain of the Pacific Northwest, Rockies, and northern wilderness areas provides perfect concealment. Dense undergrowth, steep slopes, and variable elevation create countless places where even a large creature could remain hidden. Many regions of Alaska, northern Canada, and the Mountain West are effectively uninhabited. A creature avoiding human contact could have millions of acres to roam. The thick hair described in many encounters would be perfectly suited for cold climates. The bulk and mass reported in cases like the Wyoming woodcutters slightly makes sense, as cold weather adaptation, larger bodies retain heat more efficiently. Perhaps the biggest obstacle for Bigfoot acceptance isn't scientific, it's cultural. Western science has a deeply ingrained bias towards skepticism or anything that smacks of folklore or indigenous knowledge. This is the exact same bias that delayed gorilla acceptance for centuries to the West. We've created a system where certain types of evidence counts and others don't. A plaster cast of a footprint doesn't count, even when it shows anatomical details that would require expert knowledge to fake. Eyewitness testimony doesn't count, even from trained observers like wildlife biologists and law enforcement officers. Video footage doesn't count unless it's impossibly clear, and even then, it's dismissed as CGI. Meanwhile, new species of smaller animals are regularly discovered based on far less evidence. A few hair samples or scat can be enough to document a new rodent or bat, but for a large primate, we demand a body, preferably shot and killed like the first documented gorillas. This double standard reveals our bias. We're willing to accept the existence of small, reasonable creatures on limited evidence, but something as challenging as a large undiscovered primate requires extraordinary proof, even though the historical precedent suggests it shouldn't. The gorilla's journey from myth to accepted species offers a roadmap for Bigfoot research, but it also highlights uncomfortable truths. First, acceptance will probably require a body. As much as we might wish otherwise, the scientific establishment seems unlikely to accept Bigfoot's existence without physical remains to examine. Second, we need to take indigenous knowledge seriously. For centuries, Western science dismissed what the peoples of Central Africa knew to be true about gorillas. Their oral histories and cultural traditions represent thousands of years of accumulated observation. Dismissing this as folklore is both scientifically short-sighted and culturally arrogant. Third, we need a systemic, well-funded research in appropriate habitat. Weekend camping trips aren't sufficient to document an elusive species across millions of acres. We need long-term studies, professional equipment, and researchers willing to commit months or years of field work in remote areas. Fourth, we need to shift the burden of proof. Right now, the assumption is that Bigfoot doesn't exist unless proven otherwise. But given the historical precedent of large animals remaining undocumented for centuries, perhaps the assumption should be that vast wilderness areas could habitat unknown species unless thoroughly surveyed, which they haven't been. When you examine the gorilla precedent alongside the evidence from North America, the question shifts. We're no longer asking, could a large primate possibly exist undetected in North America? We're asking, given that large primates have remained undetected in supposedly well-explored regions before, and given that North America has even more vast wilderness and even lower population density, why wouldn't an undiscovered primate population be possible? The forests of North America are vast, the wilderness areas are enormous, and the historical precedent is clear. Large, intelligent primates can remain hidden in plain sight for centuries, known to local populations, but invisible to distant science. Maybe it's time we learned from history instead of repeating it. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.